Chapter 13, We Cannot See Everything. I've learned over time that trials in life shape us more than the good times. Solomon wrote a lot about that in the book of Ecclesiastes. We are allowed to choose how we handle adversity, but there are times when we learn a lesson quickly. Other times, the meaning is found in trials, and it comes over many years, but that's no guarantee. Sometimes adversity and trials contain wisdom and lessons that we never learn at all. While we would all like to wring out any wisdom quickly and get on with life, I believe we all fit into each of those categories. Some lessons from trials come quickly, others slowly, and some lessons are never learned at all. One thing I've noticed over the years of life that God has given me is we rarely see the greatest trials coming. Yes, there are times when we can see them, but maybe the loss of a loved one, well, maybe it's not much of a surprise at all. They could be sick for quite some time, and we have time to prepare ourselves, let's say. A future chapter will cover that one a little bit from my world. Since I have a little experience in that area, I feel qualified to offer this as well. When it comes to the death of a loved one and a new chapter that arrives with it, we have no way of truly knowing what that feels like until it's actually here. Hours spent thinking of what actually feels like are mostly wasted time. We have no good idea how it will feel until it's here. When trials step into our lives, a world will come knocking, and that's a completely different story. I had a few of those at the point that I'm covering here and that I'm about to share. As I look back, it's still intimidating. Before I move into this chapter, I want to mention one thing. I have no idea who will be reading or listening to this story of my life. I have told you to begin this chapter in this book that there's a reason for that. Sure, I want you to go back and begin at chapter 1, but the events of this chapter have shaped me more in a shorter period of time than any of the others that God has given me so far. To really know who Todd Bettis is and why I am the way I am, well, this chapter says a lot. Enough of that. Let's get started, but I'll take a short break as I write this just to prepare myself. Before I jump in with both feet into the events of my own life, I'd like to ask a favor of you. It's been a couple of chapters since I've asked you to look in your world, so let's explore that for a few minutes if we could, please. As I mentioned before, my intention when writing my story is to offer a view inside someone's life and some of the trials that have been faced. Trials from my life are in this book, but I also want you to consider the trials that you may be facing in yours. As I look at the world around me and the people I know, it's easy to believe that others have had it easier than I have. Can you relate? I would never want to assume all of our lives are on equal footing when it comes to trials. In fact, I know that's simply not true. What I see over and over again are people telling portions of their story, and I'm amazed. Sometimes as I listen, I wonder if I would have given up or what I would have done if I were in their place. Before I heard their story, well, I just saw the glossy outside show. Those are the things that we show the world. You know, the things we actually want people to see. In this social media world that we live in, we see that a lot. I'm sure we've all seen it in the marriages around us too. One minute things seem good, and the next minute we're all given the true vision of the trials behind the scenes. I don't want to get ahead of myself though. What I want to ask is for you to consider the trials that you've personally faced. I'm not asking you to share those openly like I'm about to. That simply isn't my place to ask you to do such a thing. What I am saying is that acknowledging the existence of issues and trials is the very first step. If we refuse to acknowledge a problem, why on earth would we ever consider fixing it? I hope some of the lessons I've learned along the way resonate in your life story. When I began part 3 of my story, I got away from going year to year in this little book of mine. Some things run together over time, and it becomes difficult to untangle them. I want to address a few of them, one at a time. The first one I will cover comes with a good helping of caution. The caution is due to the love and respect I have for the individuals involved. As soon as I begin the story, I'm certain you will understand that. The time is shortly after Julie and I were married. We were still living in our first little ranch house on Eastgate before we moved to the cabin. The weight of the trial came through at that point, but the actual trial had been going on for quite some time. I'll cover one side of it more in the future chapter on the influence of fathers. For now, let's just get to the main subject. Julie and I were still very much newlyweds. We were living in that first home, as I said, and getting used to our day-to-day lives together. It was at that time in our lives that our marriage with our parents and from our parents, well, it changed. It was at that time that my parents divorced. As I've already mentioned in some details, it remains outside of our family unit. It wasn't a total shock, but yet it was. The reality of such a thing in your life is impossible to put into words. Dad and Mom had come to visit Julie and me right after we were married. We were walking around our little yard and had just stepped through the gate to the backyard. At that point in the walk and in the conversation, they told me that they were going to talk to a marriage counselor. All the details of that conversation are still a little fuzzy now, but those details are still very clear to me. It was no great secret that they had some things they needed to work out. I guess I just assumed they would talk it out and that life would keep rolling along. Maybe you've heard what people say about assuming things. That proved to be true in my case. Out of respect for Mom and also for the memory of my father, I won't say a lot. So, Mom moved in with us for a little while. Looking back, I don't remember it messing with our lives at all. I'm sure Mom probably felt that it did, though. But I don't remember that being the case, even once. We had 2 extra bedrooms, and she came to live with us. That was the end of the story as far as I was concerned. Mom needed us, so we helped. Mom blames herself and their divorce for some of the greater challenges that I'm about to cover. That's just her nature, though. First, she wanted to love and care for her children when she herself needed to be cared for. That's the way my mom loves, and it's very special. On top of that, she feels all the turmoil in the family pushed me too much emotionally. What she simply could never know was the turmoil inside me was already brewing. The events that were about to cascade down in my world would have happened regardless of that situation. I will not deny the emotional pain that divorce brings. I cannot pin more on that situation simply because that would be easy to do, because it's simply not true. I had a lot going on, and no one else had a clue. Looking back, I wasn't even aware of the train headed my way, and I was standing on the tracks like before, just wondering what that distant light was that just seemed to keep getting closer. Mom's found some footing in her life, and Julie and I found the cabin. We were going about life and living it the only way we knew how. There was an incident at this time I want to mention. To say that it seemed quite insignificant is an understatement, but here's how it played out one summer afternoon. We had gone skiing and tubing with Julie's brothers. Darren had a new boat, and we all went out to the lake. A thunderstorm rolled in that summer, and it ran us back to Julie's parents' house. I was in my mid-20s, but still couldn't turn down a good game of Nerf hoops. Julie's younger brother, Daryl, was willing to play, so we did. Their hoop was over a doorway with hardwood floors, Socked feet on hardwood floors is a tough way to shoot hoops, even if the hoop is shortened to a little over 6 feet off the ground. As we slipped around, I became frustrated. I couldn't move like I wanted to. Randy Boo and I had spent hours, if you remember right, playing that same game. I just wasn't as smooth as I wanted to be. Finally, I just blurted out, "Man, I just can't move very well. What's wrong with me?" It only took a second or two for Julie's dad to answer. The hoop was hanging near the family room, where he happened to be seated. Without missing a beat, he said, "Well, I know why you feel like that. I bet you weigh 200 pounds now." What? Whoa. That was a bit uncalled for, don't you think? Not because of what he said, or how he said it. It was uncalled for because that couldn't be true. Or was it? As we played a few more minutes, well, my curiosity got to me. When the game broke up, I walked down the hallway to the back bedroom. I knew there was a set of scales in the bathroom back there, and that would set the record straight. I'd never used scales before because I never had to. I weighed myself once or twice a year. In high school, I was always around 170 pounds. But 200? Not a chance. What did the scales reveal that day? I stepped on and waited for the final number. 191. Good. And bad. First, I wasn't 200. I'm 5'10", and with a good frame, I guess. 170 to 180 is an okay weight for me. I realized that that's just a number, but it was significant to me. Still, 191 was 10 or more than I like to see. I never have cared about my weight at all, but my sluggish performance at the hoop was maybe a little evidence that I needed to drop a few pounds. Oh, that seems simple enough. A better diet, maybe some exercise, and then done. Or so I thought. Like I said, just a side note for now. Let's just keep rolling with trials. I can assure you this time in my life had good times too. I will go a step further and say that I had great times. I covered a few of those in the last chapter. The reason I wanted to put these things first in part 3 and all together is because these events were significant. I believe we all have events that shape us. You may have experienced some in your life at a much younger age than I did. It could be you had a few more years of life lived before this many trials came to you. We all have them. What I have found and continue to look at is how do we come out of them? What do we learn? Do we learn anything at all? I won't say I learned as quickly as I would have thought that I might. When I finally settled down, many years after all these events, I really think I did gain some focus. It was that focus that finally prompted me to write this book. So, let's get to another life event. With all the turmoil with my mom and dad, I always had Julie. We had each other and kept making our life together. The other stable thing in our life was the business, Pineco. When Brad and I came to an agreement on ownership, I only wanted in on the landscape side of things. As I mentioned before, the garden center and plant sales didn't interest me at all. I helped with those things, but that aspect of the business just didn't interest me. We formed a new company called Green Thumb Landscapes to take on the landscape workload. Brad and I co-owned that business together. We were building and growing quite a bit. We had one work crew going all the time. The winter months were slow, but I kept busy on potting plants for spring and making general repairs. In the busy season, we were just swamped. There were times when 2 crews went out, and we covered 4 counties here in southern Illinois on a regular basis. I preferred staying right here and around our town of Olney, but people from all over came to the garden center, and if they needed something planted or work done, off we went. On a personal level, Brad and I were together daily. We would meet early before anyone else arrived. Any last-minute planning was done at that time before I left for the morning. We would meet up again for lunch and take on any appointments that needed to be taken care of, and they were just crossed off the list. It was a nice little system we had developed. It was consistent, and I felt like I had the world by the tail. I tried to roll through any instability from my parents' divorce and concentrate on work and building a growing business that I absolutely adored. It was a great time in my life. You might imagine my surprise when the event that I'm about to cover happened. I doubt if I will ever have anything like that blindside me more than this event. And this is how it happened. Our family was gathered together at our house. I'll cover why we were gathered later in this chapter. We were out on our back screened-in porch, and the phone rang. Now, this was the year 2000, before personal cell phones. I went inside and answered it. Brad was on the other end, which was strange under the circumstances. We'd been together earlier that day, so why would he call now? Also, he was aware of our family gathering. What was so important that it couldn't wait? My curiosity and anxiety grew a little as he spoke to me. He asked if he could come by and pick me up. What? He knew I had company, and I would see him early tomorrow morning. So why talk? Why now? But I could tell he was upset. So I went outside and waited for him to come to pick me up. Julie had a bit of a curiosity in her eye, wondering what was going on, but I excused myself and walked out the front to wait for Brad. To this day, I can take you to the point just down our road where we were when he broke the news to me. About a half a mile from my driveway, he told me he and Jane were divorcing. There's that word again. Not only that, but Jane was going to keep their lake house here in town, and he was moving to Wyoming, where they owned a vacation cabin. Excuse me? What did you just say? It wasn't until I sat here to write this book and relive that night that I realized I can't remember anything else about that night. I'm sure everyone was still there when I returned. We weren't gone long. I just don't remember anything else. What had just happened to my world? I didn't want to think about it. Now, he said I could buy him out of Pineco and his half. But really? Could I? Julie and I had sold my truck, and we had given all we had just to finance half of Green Thumb alone. And I'm not a big fan of big debt. I had reasons to hold back. Were my feelings correct back then, though? Did the second divorce in my world just destroy my life as far as work was concerned? Was all this real? My world seemed to be spinning out of control. I was too numb to know what was even possible. As I type this, and now as I read this, my chest pounds, and it makes my head hurt a little. It's still very real to me today. Very real. There were plenty of changes coming into my world, like it or not. I'll continue to share those in future chapters, but honestly, sharing these things is much more difficult than I thought it would be. I thought it would be bad, but it's worse than I had imagined. Brad had made that call to me and broke that news in early August. Before Christmas that year, I had wrapped up the final work and all of the orders of Green Thumb Landscapes, and I was just trying to get my footing. I wasn't just looking now for a new career. I was desperately seeking some stability emotionally. It was not good. I know I was putting an even larger load on Julie than I could even imagine. For the first time in any part, from our courtship to our married life, I was in no condition to lead and to be the husband that I desperately wanted to be. I would even say that I wasn't the husband she needed, but that's not my call. I certainly don't feel like I was any of that as I look back. I needed some control in a world, and I felt like I had no control at all anymore. That was just the reality of my new world, whether I liked it or not. So, I'll take a breath and let's get on to some better news. I'll begin by telling you about the gathering we had when Brad had called me away that night. It was a birthday party. Whose party? Well, Julie and I had been trying to start a family since our last year in our first house on Eastgate. After a couple years of marriage, we began. Many couples experience a time period where things don't happen as quickly as they would like. We were in that club. It didn't happen suddenly, but the day came when Julie showed me the test. Positive. Oh, yeah, you bet we cried together. And on August 13th, 1996, Luke Todd Bettis was born. It was a day I will never forget for sure. You bet I was proud of a dad as you ever will see. And if you know the theme of this chapter, you will not be surprised when I tell you, it was complicated. So here comes the trial. Luke was already a few days late in getting here. One night, just before going to bed, Julie thought it was time to go. We went to the hospital, but thought they would just probably send us back home. But they didn't. We stayed through the night as we waited for Luke to make his grand entrance. We didn't want to know if it was a girl or a boy, but the doctor slipped one day while he was talking to Julie. We didn't know for sure, but we had a pretty good idea. After beginning this delivery at about 10 p.m. on the 12th, things just weren't going well. At one point, Julie began to have some complications. Now, I'm not a doctor, nor would I ever claim to be one. I don't have the same respect for this doctor that Julie did. It was just a feeling, and I trust those. There was just something about him that hit me wrong from the very beginning, not just this night. Once the complications began, things did not improve. At one point, I'm telling you, I could have punched him. I am not that kind of guy, but I didn't trust him, and he simply seemed incompetent to me. Julie was in bad shape, and I was scared. I'm sure she was too, but I can't speak for her. After a while, it seemed like a couple of hours, they told us they needed to do an emergency cesarean section, a C-section. I was given orders on where to go and what to put on. A nurse would get me when they were ready for me to join them. Once we were in the operating room, things moved quickly, very quickly. It seemed like in no time at all, we got to meet baby Luke for the first time. Julie seemed better as the doctors assured me that she was fine. You bet we cried there together. Tears of joy, gratefulness, and stress rolled down our cheeks. And a short time later, I was able to hold him. We still have that picture of me with our baby boy as I sat in a rocking chair. In fact, it's on top of my dresser. I was so concerned about his little head. That first doctor, and I use the term doctor loosely, had pulled so hard on that suction cup that his little head was horribly elongated. I told you I could have punched that guy. I hadn't seen Julie yet either, since they took me out of the operating room. I was worried about my wife and our little baby boy. I was supposed to be so happy, yet I was so confused. Julie was eventually let back in the room. It was a tremendous relief for me just to finally get to see her. She was in a lot of pain, but she was okay. Baby Luke was doing well, and I believe I experienced the first migraine of my life. But my migraine is nothing compared to what Julie went through and our baby boy. Wow, what a day. So that party we were hosting, when Brad came by to get me, was actually Luke's 4th birthday party. Those emotions that I felt the day he was born, they were right back in my world. I was supposed to be happy and thrilled with all the blessings in my life, just like the day that Luke was born. But after Brad told me about the pending divorce and the changes on the horizon, I was just as confused as I was the day that Luke was born. Wasn't this supposed to feel different? What just happened to my life and the world that I knew? Now, the theme of this entire book has been wrapped up in each chapter with Red. So, what was happening with Red during those chapters in my life? I'm an adult man at this point in my life in the story. Does Red even matter at this point? Just like many periods in my life, I had decided it was just the world I lived in, and I accepted it. To this day, I don't like big crowds. While my reasons may be a little different these days than back then, it was because of that unknown factor. What is that? I think I described it in an earlier chapter, but it was just not knowing what would happen next with old Red. Malls were one of the worst places to go. The masses of people at that time was the perfect environment for some unannounced stares and snickers. I just expected it. Even as a grown man, it wasn't fun though. It was just something I wanted to avoid if I could. Those feelings can come racing back, even now. Accepting that kind of life was the way I rolled through things. That was until the day Brad suggested I look into new laser surgeries that were available. There were huge strides being made in the laser technology, and he wondered if I'd be interested. After checking into it, I decided to make an appointment, and Brad and I went over to Barnes Hospital in St. Louis. The technology was new, but had been tested. I learned a few things in my initial appointment. First, I saw numerous pictures of others who had been successfully treated and their birthmarks had been lightened. The laser doesn't remove it. The tissue is just lightened. They basically use a pencil-like laser in their hand to shoot the tissue surrounding the mark. The blood flow into the mark is cut off, and the skin color turns to a more natural skin tone. Each shot, I was told, feels like being snapped with a rubber band. I had always intended to live out my life with Red. This new technology opened new possibilities, though. How would my life look without Red? Would my attitude change? Would my personality change without Red? Along for the ride? Would I take the chance? Well, yes. Yes, I would. I scheduled my first appointment and went back over to Barnes to begin. The procedure was quite fast, actually. Once I was in the chair, I was only there for a few minutes. A 2-hour drive over there and 2 hours back with a 30 to 45-minute appointment. Most of the appointment was waiting. I'm sure you could relate to that part. There was one other thing about this procedure. Since the blood flow was being interrupted and the laser was affecting my tender skin tissue, the red mark actually turned black. Ooh, yuck. I thought red was bad. Black was worse, much worse. It was even a little swollen, and man, was it sore for several days. And yes, it was like being snapped hard with a rubber band right between your eyes, several times. I knew it was supposed to take multiple treatments. For healing purposes, I could only receive one treatment each month. So I would get a treatment, and then for the next week to 10 days, red was black and sore. It would slowly fade just in time to do it all over again. So what happened? I don't remember the exact number of months and treatments, but I think it was 3 or 4. Was red gone? Was it a thing of the past? Actually, no. I learned that it would have taken a year or more to completely get rid of red, and after a few treatments, something became very apparent to me. Living with black instead of red was much more traumatic for me than red ever was. Even after months of treatment, red might return, and completely getting rid of it was not guaranteed. I was so self-conscious, I didn't want to go anywhere. I tried to cope, Julie and I were in a Bible study at church on Wednesday evenings at the time. Those people genuinely loved and cared for me. Remember how they came up when I was baptized? They cared for me more than anyone around me except my family. I sat in that Bible study and I wouldn't even look up. I couldn't stand the idea of catching someone looking at black, because black was even new to them. It would just crush me. We still have a photo of Tim, Ann, Julie, and me at a St. Louis Cardinals game when black was along for the trip. Let's just say, that's not my favorite photo. Red was around for sure. All the battle was going on after my parents' divorce and before Luke's birth, and eventually the dissolution of Pineco, Green Thumb, and life as I knew it. You could say I had just a little bit going on. What is about to come in part 4 of this book and the next chapter in life was not good. Is that fair warning? I wish I had had a warning. Well, on second thought, I really doubt if that would have helped. I probably wouldn't have listened. Remember, I had control of things. By now you already know I wanted control, but I had no such thing. I wanted to close this chapter out with a challenge to you. I've read this and believe it to be true. Quote, "You are most qualified to help the person you used to be." Maybe that explains my desire to write this story, pain and all. There are valleys, I understand. Valleys I understand very well. Very well. And I'm sure you have some valleys you understand too. Will we reach out to help someone who is in the place that we once were? Will you? Will I? I'm writing this book to say yes. Yes, I will. How about you? Some nasty seeds had been planted in my life. There's scripture about that. So will they sprout or die? And if they do sprout, what will I do with them? On to part 4 and the next chapter of life as I've known it.